But this isn't what Antifa wants or cares about, and it's not what other radical elements want. They want war.
We're seeing the return of rioting and looting. During riots, this Democrat mayor has often prevented the police from making arrests. And even when arrests are made, liberal, progressive DAs release the rioters so as not to disrupt the rioting.
When there's looting, people get shot and they die.
Welcome to America. I guess this is where we are now. Oh great, they were at the RNC convention too. That's just perfect.
What you saw happen to us could just as easily happen to any of you who are watching from quiet neighborhoods around our country.
No, Karen, I don't think this could happen to me. I don't have a castle to protect. Okay, let me back up for a second. I'm getting a little too excited. In June of 2020, there were multiple Black Lives Matter protests in St. Louis, at one of which protesters gave the mayor of St. Louis a pile of letters discussing how they feel police should be defunded. She later read and responded to these letters in a Facebook live stream and was overall pretty condescending about the concerns of the residents of her city.
And so they gave me some papers about how they thought. In fact, I'll go pick it up off my desk. Hang on. So they presented some papers to me about how they wanted the budget to be spent. Here's one that wants $50 million to go to cure violence, $75 million to go to affordable housing, $60 million to go to health and human services, and have zero go to the police.
Granted, asking for $0 to go to the police is a pretty tall order, but that doesn't excuse what she did next. She proceeded to publicly read out the names and addresses signed on these letters, and then claimed that doing so was okay because the names and addresses were public information anyway.
$75 million to cure violence, $210 million to affordable housing, $100 million to health and human services, zero to police. Same address. This is interesting. All these folks are at the same address, so maybe this is an office.
Many people saw this as an intimidation tactic, as publishing the names of protesters could result in retaliation from their employers or police themselves. So protesters decided to move the protest through a gated community, with the destination being the mayor's house. They wanted to protest in front of the mayor's house and demand that she resign. It was on this journey through this prestigious private neighborhood full of mansions the protesters could never afford that the crowd began passing Mark McCloskey's multi-million-dollar residence. And well, this happened. Now let me make something abundantly clear. Not all Black Lives Matter protests are peaceful. Some of these have turned into riots. But this specific protest was peaceful. Mark McCloskey later went on to say that he and his wife decided to walk out of their mansion with their guns because he apparently knew that police would not intervene if the protesters attempted to kill him or burn down his residence.
I was a victim of a mob that came through the gate. I didn't care what color they were. I didn't care what their motivation was. I was frightened, I was assaulted, and I was in imminent fear that they would run me over, kill me, burn my house.
The problem is, there really were no signs of this protest becoming a riot, especially from McCloskey's standpoint. While he claims the gate to his private street was broken down by protesters, there actually isn't very much evidence proving that this gate was broken during the protest. McCloskey claims that this gate was broken, and he sent many news outlets pictures of the gate being broken, but other eyewitness accounts say the gate was just open. And when asked if his property suffered any damage from these protests, he can't point to anything beyond his feelings.
Did anything happen to you or your property?
Did anything happen? Yeah, my life has been ruined. I'm the target.
We'll get to that, Mr. McCloskey. I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm saying that night, did anything happen to you, your family, or your property?
Yeah, it's called social intimidation. It's called terrorism. Chris, what's the definition of terrorism? To use violence and intimidation to frighten the public. That's what was happening that night. It's what happened to me, and that's the damage I suffered.
You were the one pointing a loaded weapon at a group of people who were walking past looking for the mayor's house.
But wait, his property wasn't damaged, so maybe he did in fact actually protect his property by wielding these guns in front of protesters. Maybe that's what it took to secure his property, his family, and his wife's safety. If that was the case, I'd like to ask why the other houses in his gated community didn't burn down then, as he and his wife were the only people pulling this type of stunt, and no one else tried to defile or damage any of the other houses in this neighborhood, so it wasn't like he actually protected his house if they weren't trying to destroy the houses around him to begin with. It all comes down to an overly heightened fear of protesters, minorities, and the Black Lives Matter movement itself. So in this episode of Finding Subtext, I aim to unpack why exactly you see boomers threatening college students with assault rifles. Let's get into this. The liberal mob is really at it again. It's been 6 weeks since I've been able to leave the house because they're just rioting and looting my suburban environment, and I don't know what to do. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to take my flawless Aryan family unit out to church if I can't even leave the house safely. Oh Back in late May and early June of this year, when protests were at their highest point, my boss did something that really puzzled me when I was at work one day. For the sake of this video, let's call him Paul. Yeah, that's the male version of Karen, right? I'd say he's in Mark McCloskey's demographic, minus the mansion. He's in his early 60s and he's been upper middle class for quite a long time, and so is the rest of his family. And I remember one day when I was about to get in the car and leave work for the day that he started telling me about how his daughter is keeping her children at his house so they can be farther away from the city. Because she was worried, and so was he for that matter, that Antifa or Black Lives Matter was going to burn down her house and kill her children, presumably because she's white and upper middle class. It took literally every fiber in my soul to not just say, "Sir, you're in the least vulnerable demographic possible when it comes to being killed in a violent act," but you know, I gotta keep my $12 an hour independent contractor job somehow. However, I think his angst is extremely common in his demographic.
Do you stand with Nancy Pelosi and the liberal mob?
The liberal mob has become our media's antagonist this year. It's being mentioned in basically every conservative advertisement ever, almost as if being against the liberal mob is a policy of some sort.
Michelle Fischbach will oppose Pelosi's agenda and stand up to the liberal mob.
This genre of advertising can give you a window into the mind of the target audience. In their minds, these protests are just thinly veiled riots done by liberal anarchists with the end goal of rioting and f***ing shit up. The entire goal here, in their opinion, is to riot. There was no protest, no Black Lives Matter, no anything they were trying to actually fight against. They just want to tear things down. They believe there is no racism perpetrated by police at a large scale, and so if they don't believe there's a reason to protest, they're more likely to believe that the protest is based on ulterior motives. They see photos like this of buildings burning down and are completely divorced from the frustration that led up to people doing this in the first place, because they simply do not see the reason people are frustrated to begin with. When you have people in the McCloskey demographic who have never experienced discrimination firsthand, they're going to believe that the reason to protest is to riot, that rioting was the ultimate end goal. I can't believe I'm saying this because it feels like I'm gatekeeping an idea, but If you've never experienced discrimination firsthand, it can be really difficult to wrap your mind around movements like Black Lives Matter. In a more recent conversation I've had with my boss Paul, he's claimed that he of all people would know that there's no institutional racism in America because he's traveled the country quite a bit. And if there actually is racism in America, it's typically against him for being white. On a side note, I've never told him about my identity, so he just assumes I'm gay and I've never corrected him. And so oftentimes he claims that, especially in my industry, homophobia is just no longer a problem anymore. And in fact, I should be using my gay card to get myself a higher end job in the future because that's totally how it works. And I've also caught him talking about how progressive he is to other people because he has the gay employee now. Can I just leave this country, please? Anyway, this is yet another facet of the McCloskey demographic mindset. They see movements like Black Lives Matter or LGBT Pride, and since they are oblivious to the difficulties minorities face and assume everyone is treated equally already, they perceive these movements the same way a minority would perceive white pride or straight pride. The end goal of Black Lives Matter is to bring minorities up to a level playing field, especially when it comes to our justice system. But if you already believe black people are treated exactly the same as white people by police, then you think the boost Black Lives Matter aims to give minorities translates to minorities having more rights, being less responsible for their actions and not having to follow the law like white people have to. While I do believe that people with the McCloskey mindset can be of younger age, I think the vast majority of people in this demographic tend to be on the older side of things. Someone Mark McCloskey's age was born in the mid-1950s. They were alive when Martin Luther King was, and when he was assassinated. You really didn't need to hide your racism back then. Hell, schools were just becoming desegregated, on paper that is. These people have never faced a conventional form of discrimination. And so when the whites only signs and gays can't marry laws started to fade away, they thought that was the discrimination fading away too. While we no longer write down our racist and homophobic laws on paper, our oppressive laws of the past have evolved into the future. Yeah, on paper we did desegregate public schools around 60 years ago, and yet to this day, many public elementary, junior high, and high schools are still extremely segregated, even in very liberal areas like New York City. Yeah, you no longer can be arrested for simply being the wrong color at the wrong time like you could back in the Rosa Parks days. Yet police still arrest people of color at a way higher rate than white people for the same crimes, especially when it comes to marijuana arrests. Marijuana was originally popularized in America by Hispanic immigrants in the 1900s, and while other aspects of the drug's reputation evolved, its reputation being linked to people of color never did. By the year 1970, it became a Schedule I drug, which puts it at the same level as heroin under the law and one level above meth and fentanyl. Fentanyl, the drug responsible for the majority of drug overdoses. Yeah, that fentanyl, which apparently is a level better than marijuana and ecstasy. I doubt I have to state this, but marijuana cannot be overdosed on, and overdosing on ecstasy itself is extremely rare. Another curious element here is that marijuana is in a category where the drug presents no medicinal benefits, while meth and cocaine are simply defined as an addictive drug, in the same category as ADHD medication like Adderall or Ritalin. This is the system the Drug Enforcement Administration operates on, and this broken scheduling system influences sentencing for drug-related crimes. The lower the schedule number, the larger the consequences, and while marijuana offenses are rarely enforced to the fullest extent of the law, it's telling that drugs most associated with white people like Xanax are so low on the scheduling system. In my opinion, this is an early example of the American government replacing overtly racist laws with laws that didn't seem racist on a surface level but aimed to discriminate. Even when you control for usage differences, which are negligible at best, black people are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana offenses than white people are. And even though marijuana arrests have declined at a national level, since 2010 they've been stagnating, with 9 out of 10 arrests being for possession rather than use. States like Montana and Kentucky are almost 10 times as likely to arrest a black person for marijuana possession than a white person. That's almost 1000% the white arrests. And these numbers are when you control for usage disparities between races, which, by the way, white people and black people use marijuana at a similar rate, and in 31 states, the racial disparity in arrests has actually gotten worse in the last 10 years. But maybe I'm just being a woke, cherry-picking star gender attack helicopter, and I'm sure even if police do disproportionately arrest black people for the same crimes, the justice system doesn't see race, and they just sort it out in the courts, right? Well, on average, black men get a 19% longer sentence than white men do for similar crimes, which unfortunately makes sense because according to the American Psychological Association, people tend to see black men as larger and more threatening than white men of the same size, and therefore get harsher treatments by juries, especially in trials involving a violent crime. Well, if they're so concerned about black lives, maybe they should stop crying over the few people who wouldn't comply and instead stop shooting each other in their ghettos, my boss Paul would say. Now, I like to believe that when people say things like maybe they should stop killing each other, that it's not rooted in racism, but rather a genuine and complete misunderstanding for why and how people commit crime. That being said, I wanted Donald Trump to win in 2016, and now I'm a full-blown attack helicopter libtard, so I think people can change, and I also think people can take good intentions and put them into really bad ideas. I'd like to believe that I always had decent intentions, and I took those intentions, mixed them with some naivety and confusion, and put them into some really bad ideas. So I'd like to be really optimistic and think that people who say things like, why don't they stop killing each other if they care about black lives, are not saying this out of racism or as a racist dog whistle, but instead, most people who say this are just confused and ignorant. That's what I hope, at least. So with that in mind, for all the racists in the audience who are just totally edging themselves right now, let me finish you off. Black people in America commit up to 37% of violent crimes, while being just 13% of the population. There you guys go. I hope all the racists in the audience just came themselves. That being said, people living in households below the poverty line are more than 2 times as likely to commit a violent crime. And black people are more than twice as likely to be below the poverty line than white people are. But as my boss Paul would say, and this is where we venture a lot further into the racist territory here, well, if they want to not be victims of violent crime or treated like criminals by police, they should just work harder, stop being poor, and invest in their communities. What's being implied here is the reason we have ghettos is because black people are just too lazy to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and work harder and pursue a better education, and that they're somehow innately worse at making choices. This is just a taste, a morsel, if you will, of a racist dog whistle. The implication here is that the reason we have ghettos primarily populated by people of color is because they're just somehow innately worse at making choices. They're too lazy to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get themselves out of poverty. The racism in this line of thinking is extremely subtle and very interesting and complicated to unpack here, but I'm going to try my best to explain it in a very concise manner. What this line of thinking is assuming is that people of color always have the agency and ability to pursue opportunities the same way as white people have to. And so the only possible explanation for them not seizing these opportunities that they supposedly have is just because I don't know why they don't do these things. I don't know why they don't stop shooting each other. I don't know why their communities are so bad. When they say, I don't know, I think they do know deep down, they just don't want to say it out loud. It's because they're black. These black people aren't pursuing these opportunities that I think they have, so, you know, they have to go sit in their other area. This line of thinking, in my opinion, is extremely ignorant and flawed, and you can disprove it with some simple statistics and information. Trying to survive below the poverty line is something that is extremely conducive to juvenile violence. When you're in a school district with a complete lack of quality education and don't have access to a safe and clean home environment from a young age, it's no wonder people in these situations are statistically more likely to drop out altogether. Not to mention, because of America's long-running social and economic discrimination and segregation, many people of color suffer from generational poverty, which puts them at a greater risk of domestic violence, drug abuse, and more. People in these communities are less likely to succeed because they're born into an environment where they don't have access to a path to success. Race is not the deciding factor here, it's class and a history of discrimination. And hold on one second, this is me going completely off script for a second, but in the process of making and writing this video, I've had to look through some really disgusting conservative YouTube videos and trying to figure out, like, what are their talking points? What are their arguments? Why do they believe the things they believe? But don't get me f***ing started about the IQ test that these people love to bring up all the time. Really disgusting conservative grifters like Lauren Chen are talking about how immigrants and, people of color, but they don't say that out loud, but people of color tend to have a lower IQ score than white people, and so that's why they're more poor and they suffer from all of these economic and social issues.
Are higher taxes and big government really the answer to Germany and Finland's success? It couldn't possibly be because they have overwhelmingly homogenous populations, right? Populations that, by the way, also have a higher average IQ and narrower distribution than the US does.
IQ tests are extremely unreliable, can be gamed easily, and have a heavy bias towards people who come from more affluent and highly educated backgrounds. It is not a statistic you use to say that a community has less intelligence than a different community. It's not an intelligence scale. It really isn't, and I really wish people could understand this. I think what really gets to me about people on the far right and our president using IQ to sort of imply that people of color deserve to be in poverty more is that I used to sort of believe that, and it really freaks me out that I used to believe that because, again, I like to assume that I had somewhat decent intentions here, but I used to think they have lower IQs. That means that community's less intelligent somehow. It's not an objective measurement. I guess I just need to come to terms with the fact I used to be racist at some point. I was gays for Trump before it was cool. Okay, let's move on. If you believe that communities of color are solely to blame for their criminal, economic, and educational struggles, even after looking at the facts and figures behind the matter, then you're suggesting you believe that people of color are just worse at making decisions for no reason other than the color of their skin. Because if all the variables in a black person's life are totally just free and open choices, they have all the opportunities in the world, all the privileges that white people have, if you believe all of these things are choices, then really the only thing that's not a choice in that situation is their skin color. That's the only thing you can't right away as a choice or willpower. And at that point, you're just associating a skin color with a situation, with a struggle. As I've mentioned earlier, black men in particular are often perceived as more threatening than white men of the same size. And that problem, being perceived as more threatening, is a massive obstacle in the justice system, but it doesn't just stop there, because it's not just that they're perceived as more threatening, they're perceived with a lot of other unconscious negative bias as well. And this goes way beyond the criminal or justice system. This goes into every facet of life. Unfortunately, horrifyingly, it's common knowledge within the medical community that people of color are more likely to die of chronic illness, often due to doctors discriminating against patients. They're more likely to be marked for drug-seeking behavior when they go to a hospital for pain, making it extremely difficult to get treatment. And black women are 40% more likely to die of breast cancer, despite being less likely to develop it. With all of these statistics in mind, with people of color not even being able to get the proper medical care they need in some cases, it's really no surprise that people have taken it upon themselves to fuck shit up. Think about it. Just approximately 8 years ago, we were talking about the Trayvon Martin case for what seemed like months on end. He was truly the center of the news cycle for quite a long time. But since then, possibly hundreds of people of color have been shot by police while being unarmed and innocent. And it's gotten to a point where all their names, all their faces have blurred together. It's kind of like the Columbine effect, where we all remember Columbine, we all talked about Columbine for a really long time, but there's been countless incidents since then, oftentimes severely more graphic, and we do nothing about it. I don't think I can even count how many protests and how many strategies people have adopted. Ways to ask the government, can you please not kill people for no reason at disproportionate rates just because they're minorities, please? Can you do your jobs and fix that? We've tried every strategy and protested probably tens of thousands of times at this point, and seemingly nothing's changed. So it's really no surprise that you're starting to see buildings burn down. Oh shit. I think I should be safe from the liberal mob for now, but who knows what lengths liberals will go to destroy all conservatives and install a socialist Marxist utopia. Are you really trying to grift this hard right now? No, I'm just using my free speech to question why liberals support looting people's businesses and rioting in the streets. My life has been in danger ever since I set foot in Portland, Oregon, an Antifa stronghold. Well, could you at least turn down the color filter just a little bit, because right now this looks like a Hollywood movie when the main character steps over the Mexico border. Fine, but first, here's the names, faces, and identities of people who've done things I disagree with. I think these people should be persecuted for doing things I don't like. By the way, did I mention Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization? There is so much to unpack here with statements like that, but first of all, can you stop pretending you're in any sort of meaningful danger? Because you're not. You're just taking cameras to numerous protests and cutting together the most scary looking parts, so just stop pretending like you're about to die or something. Second of all, yes, there are a lot of protests right now, and yes, some of them have turned into riots, and yes, Portland actually is the most politically violent region in the country, but remember that only 5% of protests have any sort of violent behavior or destruction of property involved. This is according to a meta-analysis of over 10,000 protests all taking place after May of this year, with over 80% of demonstrations being connected to Black Lives Matter. So yeah, just 5% of protests involve any sort of destruction of property or violent crime whatsoever, so I feel like that's a far cry from how dangerous you're making these protests look online. Like, it's kind of disingenuous. Well, there's a reason that number is so low. In that study you cited of 10,000 protests that have all happened this year, 20% were not Black Lives Matter affiliated, which means 20% weren't held by communist anarchist radicals, which is why the number has been brought down to just 5%. You're right, that 5% number doesn't control for who is holding these protests, so if we look within the 80% of protests that have had something to do with Black Lives Matter since May of this year, the violence rate actually does go up. See, what did I tell you? By less than 2%, meaning that over 93% of Black Lives Matter protests have not involved a single act of property damage or violent crime. And yet, our police and government response hasn't really lined up with that, with nearly 1 in 10 protests being subject to government-level intervention. Well, some protests would turn to riots, and the job of the police is to restore law and order. Liberals would have you— Shut the fuck up. It actually gets worse. In 54% of protests where police intervened, weapons like tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray were fired, along with police using batons to beat protesters, many of which weren't even involved with committing a violent act to begin with. I guess they don't need due process, apparently. And in liberal strongholds like Portland, where the police are supposedly refusing to prosecute Antifa, over 35% of protests have been met with a violent response by the state. Remember that using tear gas is considered a war crime, a chemical weapon, and rubber bullets have disfigured countless people, and yet we use these on civilians. Well, it's just an unfortunate truth that police sometimes have to use force to disperse a protest, regardless of who's protesting. Shut the fuck up. Again, if you average out all protests, police intervene in just 3% of them, whereas they intervene in 10% of Black Lives Matter protests. That's a 300% difference between regular protests and Black Lives Matter protests, which is pretty incongruent to how the statistics are when you consider that Black Lives Matter protests are only 20% more likely to contain any sort of violent crime or instance of property damage. Well, tell that to these videos I posted on Twitter, showing protesters installing anarchy by doing things like lighting tiny fires in the middle of vacant roads. This is what a danger to society looks like, and this is what liberals are covering up. We need to strip these people of their due process by designating them as terrorists and locking them up in prison for life. Look at the liberal mob outside and tell me that's a peaceful protest. Sir, that's video from a stock footage website. Definitely not footage from a Black Lives Matter protest, especially not this year. Okay, maybe Black Lives Matter isn't to blame for the riot that's happening outside right now. But what about Antifa? Our president has rightfully designated Antifa as a terrorist organization. He's truly been working to restore law and order in our beautiful country, which is why you need to donate to this website right here, right now to become a Donald Trump Pro Plan Platinum Gold Card member. For a small recurring payment of $15 a minute for the next 5 months, you can become a Donald Trump Pro Plan Platinum Gold Card member. which means that Donald Trump will be waiting for you. He'll see you. He will get a personal list with your identity on it. You'll be his friend. Well, despite the garbage that Trump emails me on a daily basis, Antifa shouldn't qualify as a terrorist organization. If nothing else, for the simple fact that they don't qualify as a terrorist organization under the US State Department's definition. A terrorist organization must commit premeditated violence against non-combatant targets by a subnational group. The problem is, you can't say the violent acts Antifa has committed are premeditated because they're not a centralized group. There's no central plan or strategy for Antifa. They're just young people with local Facebook groups. The only thing that remains consistent from Antifa member to Antifa member is a general disdain for fascism and a general appreciation for vague leftist politics. Even the political ideologies of Antifa members can change wildly between each member because there's no Antifa HQ, no centralized government, no sort of master plan that they're following. Why are you even barricaded in here with me if you love bottoming for Obama's commie cock so much? Oh yeah, I'm actually seeking refuge from the conservative mob. The what? The conservative mob. I mean, if you guys can be scared of the liberal mob, why can't I be scared of the conservative mob? To this day, Antifa has been found directly responsible for 0 deaths, and as of June, just 51 protesters were facing federal charges, and none of them have been found to have a link to Antifa. There's just no legal paper trail to speak of when it comes to linking Antifa to any major crimes, yet there's plenty of documentation showing that far-right conservatives have killed over 300 people in the last 25 years alone. Not to mention, 12% of anti-Black Lives Matter protests have turned violent, so why shouldn't I be scared of the conservative mob? That's because our government is so radically liberal, so corrupt, except for Donald Trump, that they don't prosecute rioters for the people they murder, which skews the demographic. I really doubt law enforcement is exercising a pro-Antifa bias, considering the few studies that exist for this show that 84% of police officers supported Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Granted, this study could be really skewed, as it only surveyed working officers who read Police magazine, but still, I really doubt police are a gang of communists. Though one could dream. Now stop right there. I need to tell you about today's Logic University sponsor, ExxonMobil. I think I'm done here. But what about the conservative mob you claimed to be scared of earlier? I guess that was just another liberal lie of yours. Well, our government has completely given up on managing the spread of a deadly virus and does basically everything your crowd wants at this point, so I think things will be pretty calm on the conservative protest side of things until the massive influx of peaceful shootings that'll happen in November if Trump loses the presidency. So I'm just gonna take my chances until then and we'll see what happens. Originally, I was going to argue that protests from the right aren't much better from the left, and that oftentimes it's conservative rallies that end up killing people. However, aside from the confirmed settled death toll on the Antifa side being 0, and the death toll on the far right side being over 320, there's not many other statistics I can really point to here, which is a problem for me because I've never been very great at forming arguments without a lot of statistics, or at the very least, some personal experience. And in case you couldn't tell by this really ambiguous complexion, I'm white, so I can't really talk about personal experience. In fact, I've been deliberately really focusing on statistics here and numbers because I don't want to white-splain the concept of racism to people, as it's really not my lane, not my place to talk about the Black experience or any of the sort of softer social topics. So I don't have very many facts or figures to go off of here, and I definitely don't have any personal experience. So that means I have to pull some arguments out of my brain, and forming intellectual arguments is hard, and while I like some hard things, I don't enjoy effort or thinking. As a real man, I live my life by science, facts, and logic. Big number, make great point. Okay, can I change my tribe away from twink? I think I've become a real man now. What was I even talking about again? Oh right, racism. The data for right-wing violence is extremely limited, and Antifa in particular is hard to nail down, as it's such a vague and aimless group that even if a member does kill someone, it can be hard to trace back. There's been one potential murder link to Antifa, but that's about all I can find. And when it comes to conservative protests, there's also very little data about it. Probably because the mainstream media is too busy jacking off right-wingers and talking about the scary liberal protest riots. The little bit of data I can find says that conservative protests range from 3 to 12% violent, so if that helps you, then there you go. However, I think at this point we should stop focusing on which side is more violent when they protest, because I think that conservatives who aren't completely radicalized yet are moving away from protesting as a concept, at least while Trump stays in office. Nearly half of surveyed Republicans no longer support the right to peacefully protest at all. So if we can't even get them to support the "can I have rights, daddy government" genre of protesting, I don't really think it's worth arguing at all. Instead, I think we should ask if protesting in general is creating a net positive effect, peaceful or otherwise. Well, they have at least raised awareness for their cause if internet search trends are a good indicator, and 13 major cities have cut police funding by a little bit and diverted it to other social programs that could help people of color. But this change is a far cry from the systemic redistribution of funding or overhaul of the police system that people want. So in a way, it isn't super successful at furthering people's goals, at least to a full extent. I don't think it was the fault of the protesters, though. It was wishful thinking to assume that marginalized people, even in large numbers, could sway a white, borderline paramilitary bureaucracy that's the size of some other countries' militaries. With that in mind, though, I'm not sure what will sway them. In the past, the most impactful protests have involved destruction of property. Think the Boston Tea Party for a major example. But at the same time, I'm not entirely sold on rioting either, especially in every situation. That being said, depending on what happens in November, I might go help my fellow comrades burn down an AT&T store, because it's looking like the 2020 version of destroying expensive tea is racking up the insurance bill for Trump supporting retail chains in downtown environments. It's quite ironic when you think about it. Conservatives claim they need their guns to keep the government in check should police become overbearing, lest a police state be established. And yet, when they see the other side trying to keep the government in check using minor amounts of non-lethal force, they try to expand the justice system further, feeding into the very thing they claim to need weapons to fight against. Anyway, that'll be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end. This might be my longest video ever, as it was quite the topic to get through, and even to make it, this short, I had to gloss over so many different topics, so I'll be going more in depth in maybe different videos in the future, so stay tuned for that. But I want you guys to leave a comment down below and let me know what you guys thought of this video or any opinions you may have, because I read all of my comments and I love hearing the discussion you guys have. So remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.